Imagine a medieval harbor before sunrise. The water is dark. The wooden ships move gently against their ropes, and sailors are already checking barrels, siles, horses, and supplies for a journey across the Mediterranean. Among the men preparing to leave France stands Louis IX, one of the most powerful kings in Europe. He is deeply religious, respected by many of his contemporaries, and supported by the growing strength of the French monarchy. Yet within 2 years, this same king will be sick, defeated, and held as a prisoner in Egypt. So tonight, one quiet question will follow us through the story. How did a crusade prepared with such care carry a king from his throne in France to captivity beside the Nile? You do not need to remember every name or date as we travel with him. Let the details pass slowly. What matters is the shape of the journey. Faith becoming policy, preparation becoming invasion, and confidence gradually meeting the limits of geography and human endurance. By the middle of the 13th century, crusading had already shaped generations of European history. Jerusalem had changed hands several times, and in 244 it was lost from Christian control again. That same year, a major defeat at La Forbie weakened the crusader states in Eastern Mediterranean. Across Western Europe, calls for another expedition began to grow. For Louis, however, the decision was also personal. Late in 1244, he became seriously ill, and those around him feared he might die. During the illness, Louis vowed that if he recovered, he would take the cross and go on crusade. In his world, such a vow was not something easily forgotten. Religion, kingship, and personal duty were closely connected. When Louis recovered, he began turning that promise into one of the largest projects of his reign. The preparations took years. Ships had to be secured, money raised, horses gathered, and food stored. France also needed to remain stable while its king was away. So Louis again relied heavily on his mother, Blanche of Castile. Beneath these royal decisions stood thousands of ordinary workers. Carpenters repaired ships. Blacksmiths prepared weapons and fittings. Scribes recorded payments. Sailors loaded barrels of water and grain. Grooms cared for horses that would soon have to cross the sea. A crusade might be announced through faith, but it moved through logistics. In August 1048, Louis finally departed from Aix-Mortes in southern France. The harbor would have been crowded and noisy. Men carrying supplies, horses resisting narrow ramps, ropes tightening against wooden hulls, and the smell of salt, tar, leather, and grain mixing in the morning air. Once at sea, even rank offered little protection from discomfort. A nobleman could become seasick. A king could command an army, but he could not command the wind. The fleet sailed toward Cyprus, where Louis gathered his forces before attacking Egypt. The choice of Egypt was deliberate. Jerusalem was the great spiritual goal. But Egypt was one of the strongest political and economic centers of the region. Louis believed that weakening Egypt could change the balance of power across the Eastern Mediterranean. But Egypt was also a land shaped by the Nile. The river was more than water. It was a road, a food system, a barrier, and a seasonal clock. People who had lived beside it for generations understood its channels and rhythms in ways foreign armies did not. By the spring of 1040, Louis was ready to leave Cyprus. His fleet turned south toward the Egyptian coast and the city of Damietta. Years of preparation were finally becoming war. At that moment, Louis still looked like a king moving toward victory. He could not yet know that the river ahead would eventually take away almost every advantage he had brought with him. When Louis XI reached the Egyptian coast in June Quarnai, the first challenge was simply getting the army ashore. Men moved from larger ships into smaller boats while horses, shields, weapons, and supplies followed behind them. Egyptian troops waited near the coast, but the crusaders succeeded in establishing a position on land. Medieval accounts describe Louis entering the water with his soldiers, unwilling to remain safely aboard while others faced the danger first. Whether every detail was remembered exactly is uncertain, but the landing itself was a success. Then came an unexpected victory. Damietta, one of the most important cities near the mouth of the Nile, was abandoned by its defenders. The crusaders entered with little resistance. For Louis and his army, the moment must have felt like a powerful sign that their long preparation was finally being rewarded. The same city had resisted the Fifth Crusade for months, yet now it seemed to fall almost immediately. But capturing Damietta was not the same as conquering Egypt. The Nile was entering its seasonal flood, making movement farther inland difficult. Louis therefore remained in the city for months, waiting for the water to fall and for additional forces to arrive. Every day of waiting consumed food, money, and supplies. Horses needed fodder. Men needed bread and clean water. Equipment needed repair. An army could appear enormous and powerful, but its size also made it fragile. Farther south, Egyptian forces were preparing their defense near Mansurah. Their ruler, Sultan al-Sali Ayyub, was seriously ill and died dos continue. His death might have caused political disorder, but his wife Shagar al-Dur and senior officials helped preserve continuity until his son Turansha could return. Egypt remained organized. By November, Louis finally began advancing south toward Mansurah. His army moved beside the Nile while supply boats traveled along the river. These boats were essential. Without them, the crusaders could not remain in the interior for long. Near Mansurah, another branch of the Nile blocked the army's path. Egyptian defenses waited on the opposite bank. Louis' men tried to build a crossing, but the defenders repeatedly disrupted the work. For weeks, the crusaders were held in place by a narrow stretch of water. Eventually, they learned of a fort. In February 250, a group of knights crossed before dawn. Among them was Louis' brother, Robert of Artois. At first, the attack went well. Egyptian troops were surprised, and the crusaders gained ground. Then Robert made the decision that changed the campaign. Instead of waiting for the rest of Louis' army, he pushed forward toward Mansurah. Inside the city, narrow streets reduced the advantage of heavy cavalry. Egyptian forces reorganized, and Robert's men became isolated. Robert of Artois was killed.
Move forward, slowly
Many
now.
experienced knights died with him.
Formation.
Louis managed to bring more troops across the river and hold a position for a time. But the crusaders had failed to capture Mansurah. Worse still, Egyptian forces began attacking their supply system. Boats carrying food were intercepted. Grain became scarce. Disease spread through the camp. Horses weakened, and men who had arrived full of confidence began to lose strength. This was the turning point. Louis still had armor, soldiers, and royal authority, but none of those things could replace food. The crusade was no longer moving forward. It was beginning to collapse. By early April 250, Louis understood that the army could not remain near Mansurah. The only realistic choice was to retreat north toward Damietta. The city that had once represented victory had now become a place of escape. But the men preparing to leave were exhausted, sick, and closely watched by Egyptian forces. And Louis himself was becoming ill. The road back to Damietta had begun. The king would not finish it as a free man. The retreat from Mansurah began in early April 1250,
Along the Nile,
and almost immediately the weakness of the crusading army became impossible to hide. Men who had once marched beneath bright banners now moved slowly along the Nile. Many of them wounded, sick, or too exhausted to keep pace. Horses weakened. Supply wagons struggled forward. Boats carried those who could no longer walk. Egyptian forces followed closely, attacking the retreat and cutting apart groups that became separated from the main column. Louis Noifa was ill as well. As king, he might have tried to escape more quickly, leaving the slower parts of the army behind. But medieval accounts emphasize that he remained with his men. This source often admired Louis deeply, so their language should be read carefully. Yet the broader picture fits his character. Louis believed that kingship carried obligations. If his army was suffering, it would not simply disappear from it. Near Fariskur, the retreat finally collapsed. Egyptian forces overwhelmed what remained of the crusading army. Groups surrendered. Others were captured. Louis, weakened by illness and unable to continue, was taken prisoner. The King of France had become a captive in Egypt. For Louis, this was more than a military defeat. He was an anointed monarch, surrounded in France by law, ceremony, and religious authority. Now none of those things could open the doors around him. His freedom depended on negotiation. The price was high. Damietta, the city that had seemed like such a remarkable victory less than a year earlier, had to be surrendered. A large ransom also had to be paid. In May 1250, Louis was released. The reversal was complete. He had entered Egypt as a conquering king. He left captivity by giving back the city he had captured. But Louis did not immediately return to France. Instead, he traveled to the crusader states in the eastern Mediterranean and remained there for several more years. His role changed. He was no longer leading a great invasion. He focused instead strengthening fortifications, supporting vulnerable Christian settlements, negotiating with neighboring powers, and helping secure the release of prisoners. The crusade had changed from conquest to preservation. This quieter phase reveals something important about medieval power. History was not shaped only by battles. It was also shaped by masons repairing walls, sailors carrying supplies, merchants keeping ports active, and officials counting money needed for defense. Even after the great campaign had failed, ordinary life continued around it. Bread was baked,
Yes, madam.
markets
Baked
opened,
just before dawn.
ships entered harbors. Soldiers stood watch. In 1254, Louis finally returned to France. And now we can answer the question that followed us from the beginning. How did such a powerful king become a prisoner? Not because of one mistake alone. The Nile delayed his movement. The waterways around Mansurah restricted the army. Robert of Artois advanced too quickly. Experienced knights were lost. Egyptian forces recovered. Supply boats were intercepted. Food became scarce. Diseases spread. Horses weakened. The crusading army slowly lost the ability to sustain itself. Louis could command soldiers. He could not command the Nile. He could raise money, build fleets, and lead men across the Mediterranean. But he could not make food appear when supply routes were cut or make sick soldiers strong again. That is perhaps the quiet meaning of the Seventh Crusade. Power had limits. More than 7 centuries later, The banners are gone. The armies have disappeared. And the rulers who fought beside the Nile belong to history. But the river still moves toward the sea. You do not need to remember every name or every battle. Keep only the shape of the journey. A king crossed the Mediterranean with confidence, entered Egypt expecting victory, and discovered that ambition could be defeated by geography, logistics, and human weakness. The ships can fade into the distance now. The ropes settle against the wood. The water becomes quiet again, and the Seventh Crusade comes to an end.